Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon to those in Asia. Good morning to those in Europe. Thank you for joining. I see a great group of people here. I see people from the Philippines, from Indonesia, from Singapore, from Europe, from Thailand. And it's really great to see the broad group of attendees. My name is Todd Schweitzer. I am the director for Open Banking Exchange Asia, and I am really pleased to share the stage, so to speak, with my co-panelist, who I'll introduce in just a second. But first of all, thank you so much for attending. I think this is a really exciting event to kick off and introduce OBE Asia, which is really meant to be a coming together of the open banking industry for the first time across the countries of Asia to build an industry voice, to share best practices, and to learn from other regions and countries as well, because open banking and open finance generally is a movement or an initiative that's happening on the regulatory side, on the commercial side, in bankers associations, in fintech associations, kind of simultaneously around the world right now. So looking forward to sharing insights from John and sharing a peek on what OBE Asia has planned for the coming year. Just quick intro for myself. So I am double-hatted as the OBE Asia director. I also am the CEO and co-founder of Broncos, which is an open finance technology company operating across Southeast Asia. Broncos, we operate on actually both sides of open banking. So we provide API middleware and API management systems for more than 40 institutions across Southeast Asia. We also provide API aggregation, and in Southeast Asia, that's primarily data, identity, payments, and accounts management for more than 100 technology companies and actually traditional businesses as well that are plugging in financial services. We also have strategic partnerships with some of the more larger and more interesting API or an open finance oriented companies in the region. That includes Visa, Apex, and Proxtera out of Singapore, as well as Digital Filipinas, which is a kind of a digital technology movement across industries, but with a big focus on open banking. Separately from OBE, Broncos chairs the Open Banking Working Group for the Indonesia FinTech Association called AFTEC. I sit on the advisory council for Apex, which is the Singapore government and MAS's initiative to build an open finance marketplace regionally, but based out of Singapore. And then Broncos is also the facilitator, and I help co-facilitate the open finance pilot in the Philippines, which now includes 17 participating FIs. I am also very keen to introduce my co-panelist, who's the managing director for OBE globally, and is really a veteran of open banking coming out of Europe and has seen the development of the ecosystem from the region that is probably the most advanced in its open banking regulations. So John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Todd. It's fantastic, and it really is fantastic to be here today. This is our first webinar in Asia. It's great to see that we're kicking off OBE Asia. There's so much opportunity here, and it's such a wide and diverse landscape of places. You know, we know that we couldn't handle it ourselves, so it's great to be, you know, partnering with you, Todd, and your team to be taking this out across the different countries, and we'll be having a little bit look at what that looks like as we go through today. So just a bit about me. My background is actually in payments and clearing systems. I used to run Step 2, which is Europe's largest clearing system, which I went into to originally build. I've done a lot with standards and with schemes and regulators. So I was part of the original ISO 20022 standardization process. I helped write Europe's credit transfer and direct debit rulebooks. And over time then I founded something called My Bank, but also OBE, which had started off as Open Banking Europe, and now as we take it globally, it's Open Banking Exchange, so OBE. Again, within the European framework, there's been a lot of different groups, subgroups, working groups with industry participants. Some of them led by European Central Bank, some of them led by just different market bodies. And it continues in Europe now. We we create new schemes like request to pay, and I'm on their API task force. So things carry on there. But that's a bit of a historical background in the sense of my European past. I really want to get away from the Europe piece today as we're in Asia, and talk about what OBE is and what and what that means within Asia. So we're going to start. The kind of format of today is a few minutes on what OBE, Open Banking Exchange, is, and then we're going to start looking at open finance, open banking. What is it, and what is it around the world, and then specifically in Asia, and in general, how do we see ourselves working with you all to play a part in facilitating the spread of open finance, successful open finance across the region. So as Todd's just put in the chat, please do ask questions, put it in there. We'll be more than happy to kind of interrupt, and it's much more fun for us if we're hearing your thoughts, because OBE is not a lecture series where we tell you what to do. It's a dialogue. Obviously, there's so many of you on this call, we can't let you all just sort of jump in, but put it in the chat. We'll try and pick it up, and it'd be great to hear, how you're all doing. So, okay, open banking, open finance, it is a global phenomenon now. Every continent, most countries have open banking activities going on. That said, there are challenges and there are risks. There are problems with the rollout. And the major risk that we see, the major problem, is what we call fragmentation, the lack of interoperability, certainly between countries, but also inside countries. Many different standards, many different ways of implementing security, confusion over terminology. In the end, it means that the customers, the end users, are not getting the services that they expect, because even inside one country, everybody's implemented their APIs or their processes or their products slightly differently. So things don't work together. And it also becomes very expensive for the financial institutions who are exposing these APIs, who are trying to understand either through regulatory pressure or through market forces what to do, and they end up building things, rebuilding things, rebuilding things, and it increases the whole level of risk and security there for them for protecting their data if there's not a standardized framework for security, for standards, and all that goes with it. So the two weapons in our arsenal against fragmentation are working together as a community and providing information. And that's really what we're here to do. I think behind that, there's a bigger infrastructure story that comes into place, but we'll probably get onto that in future kind of webinars and discussions. But our job really is more than anything to bring the different market players together to turn either regulatory requirements or market requirements into operational reality together. And we're not, I mean, clearly every country has a banking association, maybe more than one. Most countries have some kind of fintech association, again, maybe more than one. But it's quite rare that there's places where these different parties can meet. So it's really about bringing people together and providing a common framework and information around open banking, open finance, what's going on in the world, how are other people solving problems? Because I say, you're all solving the same problems, you're all seeing the same problems, but sometimes they get solved differently. So that's the challenge. And we bring financial institutions, fintechs, service providers, security providers together. Here's a bit of a snapshot of some of the people we work with on the European front, but I'll show our sort of global spread in a second. So it's really about bringing everyone together into one place. And we've got three sort of stories we tell that we go through at different points on this slide here. One is an infrastructure framework. We've done a lot of research and cataloging of how different countries are implementing open banking. And it's amazing how different their infrastructure requirements or infrastructure deliverables are. Even between the UK and Europe that effectively had the same regulation, they made very different decisions. And that's quite interesting to look at. Everyone can understand the point of maybe an API standard, but it's less clear the kind of infrastructure that goes behind the scenes in terms of providing security or reporting or transparency or certification or many other things. The second thing we've got is what we call the handbook. I'll enlarge on that slightly in a moment, but we've gone through a series of topics that every country and every market institution will have to go through. All the chapter headings you will need to think about when you implement open banking or open finance in your country. And with those questions and those chapter headings come answers and options, and it helps everybody get on the same page as to what they're doing. Because one of the great struggles with open banking at the moment, at the beginning, open banking or open finance, is that everybody understands something different by all the terminology they're using.
And so this is what I appreciate about what the work that John and his team has done, because this is for the first time OBE has brought together use cases, terminology, taxonomy, technical standards, lessons learned good and bad, and put them in a single place so that as the BSP in the Philippines or the BOT in Thailand or the industry or the Thai Bankers Association is looking at what is the balance of policies and frameworks, they can actually learn from a single kind of repository what is the, at a minimum, what are the options to choose from, right?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I mean, that's exactly right. And we'll talk in a moment about some of the places where we're operating and some of the consultancy and help we're giving some central banks and other institutions. But it is amazing how everybody has a slightly different view of what open banking is. The technology providers think it's one thing, the lawyers think it's another thing, the payments people think it's a third thing, the regulators are on another page as well. You know, they have to be brought together with, as you said, it's a taxonomy, it's a dictionary, and this is all written out after 5 years of experience. Again, not showing everybody you must do this, but allowing them to have that conversation. And that's what we're trying to do here. It's really about coming to us for good, straightforward information about what's going on in language you can understand, in this case, across Asia. And that's the point. So I'll skip on a bit. I don't want to go on too much around all our points. Here's a slightly bigger shot of our kind of the chapter headings that we use, but each one of these circles we could drill into, and there's many subheadings in here. But you can see that the different countries have different aims and reasons for doing open banking. Is it financial inclusion? Is it competition? Is it stimulating innovation? There are different use cases. There are different actors and roles. There are different delivery. Anyway, there's a whole load of stuff that we have, and that over time during 2022 we'll be sharing with you and with members as they come on to discuss this. So yeah, a rich body of knowledge behind us. I'm not going to spend very long on any of these slides now because I think I've talked through them. I think we should get onto the kind of different countries, but yeah, we'll come on to that.
Perhaps, a question here, John, is so I think you come from the European example, which is certainly the most advanced. It's also, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but it's a very top-down approach, right? The European regulators sort of deciding that this is necessary for competitiveness and basically, requiring banks to comply, and then putting frameworks for the, who are the service providers, who can do payment initiation, what are the standards for that? So, but it's all very top-down, right? Generally speaking, and I'll cover this in a bit, but generally speaking, what we're in Southeast Asia, it's primarily bottom up, right? It's commercially led with regulators setting industry kind of guidelines. At least that's what it's looking like. So, I mean, how would OBE kind of from a European perspective, what would you bring, or some guidelines that you would propose for OBE Asia to learn from the experience, even though, there are some differences in implementation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so as we say, in different countries and different regions, we see different drivers. The regulators, in some countries, the regulators are pushing. In other countries, it's the market that's moving faster. I mean, let's face it, the market always moves faster than the regulators, but in some cases they're let off to go. In other cases, the regulators feel they have to step in, or maybe even encourage it. It doesn't matter to the different models we've got, because in the end, we see in countries where, I mean, America's at the moment, the US is one of the most, extreme examples of no regulation, very fragmented, nothing said. There's hints that they might start thinking about it now, but there's nothing. Even without that, the market players who are active, the Plaids and the Yodelers and the banks, they're sitting together to try and create the stuff that they need to make it work well for their customers, for their shared customers. So in the end, they need the same things. And whether the regulator tells you to do it, whether the regulator kind of tells an industry body to go away and think about it, or whether kind of the industry sort of naturally collects itself, they're all coming together and then solving the same problems. I mean, Europe was a very strange example, because the regulator was very prescriptive in some things, but very open in others. They just kind of said, well, you must do this, this, and this, but in some weird legal language that nobody, even them, could really understand. Off you go, get on with it. And then everybody ran, and we had 8 different organizations set themselves up to do API standards. So which is crazy, right? And there's many other sort of examples of where in some areas they should have been a little less prescriptive. In other areas, they probably should have done a bit more to help deliver. But anyway, talking about it is what's important. And we had something to do here. We standardized the reference numbering system. We work with ETSI, the European Telecoms and Standards Institute, to standardize the way the digital certificates were used. There's TS 119495, which is that. We've written JSON Web Token standard for signing that's now being brought into the API specific. So we did a lot, but that's what we did there. Now the beginning of this journey is, okay, well, what do you need in Asia, and in fact in each country in Asia, because we also appreciate that they're not all the same. So perhaps what I'll do, I hope that answered the question, Todd. I'll just jump one to sort of, I mean, we've talked about Europe quite a lot, but it was only at the beginning of this year that we launched Open Banking Exchange as a global program, saying that the knowledge that we've got from Europe and UK, which are in fact now separate, but that knowledge is repeatable, it's scalable, it can be, there are lessons that we can have general applicability. And so we're now operating in Colombia, Mexico. Here we are in Asia launching. We've got Ukraine starting up, Saudi, and for 2022, we've got Chile in January, and then we're looking beyond. And also, as I say, we started as a member program, but more and more we're finding that the regulators are actually the ones who want to hear about this. So we're doing work with IFC in the Philippines, and we'll certainly talk about that more in a while. And I mean, all the regulators really are crying out for some kind of framework and knowledge of how to do this. So, here we are. That's what we're doing, and kind of operating around the world. I do see in the chat we've got a point agreeing the idea that regulators are pushing. So this is Karen Lai who's made a point, and they're quite rightly saying that different regulators will have different objectives. Yep, agreed. I mean, UK, the Competition and Markets Authority pushed open banking because they wanted the banks to break a little bit the power of the main banks. In South America, we're seeing much more about social inclusion. In other countries, it may be innovation. So I guess, I mean, and the question in the chat there is around whether regulators should take a more active role. And okay, so that is the question, and that's one of the questions. And then the question is why. and the regulators normally have two different drivers. Either they want to push something, social inclusion, innovation, competitive advantage across globally, digitization, or all of this, or sometimes to protect. They want to ensure that, yeah, this is all great, but we have to look after our people and our customers and whatever. Certainly, we're not going to answer the question right now, should regulators do more or less in each country, because each country is at a different stage in its life cycle. I don't know what you think, Todd, but it's pretty. Was it Ronald Reagan said? Well, the nine most frightening words in the English language is, "I'm a regulator and I'm here to help." Sometimes there can be unintended consequences of getting people involved too quickly, and it can go wrong. So, yeah, I guess I think the right regulation is helpful, but
I think
what's your
my
Asian
understanding,
view on that, Todd?
So first off, I think, I hope I'm not stepping out of bounds here, but I think so OBE does not have an agenda vis-a-vis like what is the right level of regulator engagement, right? My view, just observing from the private sector and from the fintech side, is there are competing interests indeed. I think in general, the setting guidelines and allowing enough open space for the private sector to innovate, whether that's the bank side or non-bank FIs or service providers like API aggregators, I think that's overall a good thing, because the commercial case is there. It's not like the UK where there was an explicit, there was an explicit mandate coming out of the UK and openbanking.org. It's like an intro video on their homepage that basically says open banking came out of a survey that realized that banks were no longer competing for consumer and SME, right? So this was a direct result of the regulators stepping in because they saw not enough innovation. My view, just as of today, whatever, end of 2021, I think there's plenty of space for commercial innovation because it's so early, and there are such large fundamental financial services infrastructure gaps that there's actually plenty of room to solve problems and to create value through open finance. Where I think the regulators can play a role in stimulating open finance innovation is by giving some, not mandates, but giving guidelines that give comfort to the compliance departments at banks that if they provide this new type of API, this new type of service, that they're not going to have to backtrack a year from now. Right. And I think the Philippines actually, where John, you can give some color on this, but I think the Philippines example is a great example where the open finance circular and these guidelines, the purpose of them is to say more regulation is coming, but here's a broad structure so that banks, you can already start developing some of these products without fear that you're going to have to backtrack and throw away basically tech that you've been building the last couple of years. So that gives a lot of, and I can speak personally from wearing the Broncos hat, that there is having these guidelines gives comfort to the back office teams at the banks that they can greenlight an initiative without fear of
stepping over some kind of boundaries that they shouldn't be. Because this is a delicate subject. That's it's a great question. Thanks, Dan. You see, forget a couple more questions like that. We can forget the slides completely and just have a conversation, which is great. One last point on the whole kind of question there. We're not here to tell you whether regulators should or shouldn't. What we want to be doing through next year is having those conversations with you to understand whether you think they should. Where are the pain points in your country and your region or your area where actually some regulatory push or guidance that would be quite helpful, and where are the bits where the regulators are having a go, but they're actually kind of getting in the way, and it'd be better if they backed off or whatever. So this OBE Asia will be the place where you can come and sit, and we can hear both points of view from the kind of the people using the APIs, the people delivering it. And again, we have no position particularly, but we want to hear what you say. And if we have any position, it's whatever they do, it's got to be clear and it's got to work. Don't just do kind of bad regulation for the sake of it. Anyway, I'm going to jump quickly. I've got about 5 slides here, which I'm not going to kind of talk to particularly. Let's come back to that one. Just looking at the different countries, I think the point is that Australia, who's next? Brazil. Oh, sorry, my mouse is going stick. There we go. Australia, we've got Brazil, we've got Mexico, UK. These countries and many others are all putting into place open banking or open finance programs. Some of them are regulatory driven, some of them are more market driven. Some of them have a very broad scope, some are much narrower. I mean, Europe was actually quite narrow. It was really just payments accounts, whereas Brazil here has a whole load of stuff. It's around currency and exchange and investments a lot. And Australia, they've got the biggest vision from day one, where they don't talk about open finance, they think about open data. So lots of different flavors, but underneath all the same kind of underpinnings. So why don't before we let's not spend too long on the rest of the world. Todd, did you want to say a couple of things on just this, what is open finance piece, and then we'll get into Asia specifically?
Yeah, great. So this is just a kind of a definition that's born out of observing open finance developments in Asia. And the main point I want to emphasize here is there is a ton of commercial demand from FIs and from fintechs to make open finance APIs available. There is no need to wait for open banking regulation or a European style set of instructions that the banks need to follow by January 2023, right? So just a couple facts, right? 50% of the Philippines adults are unbanked. 40-something% of Indonesian adults are unbanked, right? The financing gap for SMEs, I believe, is like 80% of the total demand for SME financing. So, and remittance cost, of course, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, I mean, there are massive remittance flows, and the average transaction cost end to end is about 10%, right? That varies by country, but it's about 10%. So a domestic worker in Singapore sending money home to Indonesia is losing about 10% of his or her, $200 a month going back home, which is huge from a disposable income point of view. So the list goes on. There is no reliable credit bureau in most of these markets. There is no FICO score like we have in the US, right? In most of Southeast Asia, there is no e-identity where you can ping a database using a real-time API to verify an identity against someone's authentic SingPass credentials, right? Why do I give all those examples? Because there is a fundamental set of gaps that can be addressed by open finance. And the way I describe colloquially open finance is it's not just a set of regulations or a set of products, but it's the underlying technology, including the authentication standards and kind of the technical handshake that happens between provider and recipient. It's products, it's a set of products, not just data, but payments, account opening, authentication, and it's policies that enable customers to use financial services from qualified third-party providers. So that's a lot of words, but what the implication is that open finance in Asia, number one, and we're already seeing this today, it changes the way financial products are developed, because it doesn't need to be a bank building a wealth management or building a mass market consumer banking product that serves only a fishing community, right? By partnering with third-party apps that are serving a particular customer segment, banks and non-bank FIs can actually develop new products and provide the infrastructure where the third-party partners are actually doing the onboarding. It changes distribution. Beyond branches and agents and kiosks at a mall, you can actually have partners onboarding new customers. A great example of this is CIMB Philippines with GCash, where the majority of CIMB's customer acquisition now is happening inside an e-wallet, a third-party e-wallet, where customers choose to top up into and onboard into a new savings account that's actually a CIMB co-branded account. It also changes the way financial products are monetized. So rather than just net interest and fee revenue from transactions, you can actually if you're an FI, you can start to unlock subscription, usage, and platform fees, and the list goes on. And this is where Europe gets really interesting, is because now they're 4 years into it, and there's a whole new set of business models emerging, right?
Yeah.
So
you know what, Todd, I think, and this is such a big topic, and this is we found that this is people are really interested in this. So you know, I think next time, the next webinar when we kick off in January, we should probably just do a whole hour on, you know, different use cases, different stuff we're seeing, like why open finance. You know, I think this is a great one. People, you know, people can tell us what they want to hear, but that will be, you know, a good one to do. Yeah.
Agreed. So I guess I'll share just a little bit about kind of open finance developments in a few Asian markets. This is not meant to be a lecture on kind of open finance regulations, but just a very quick and kind of rough overview. Yeah, so Indonesia is, of course, the largest and kind of most interesting in Southeast Asia. It's also a bit complicated. So on the one side, Bank Indonesia has a very structured, very ambitious, and very top-down set of payments regulations. And this is encapsulated in their 2025 blueprint, which does indeed mention open banking and data. But if you look at the regulations and the guidance that are coming out now, it is like 99% payments focused. And in fact, there was a BI regulation that came out about 6 months ago, the details of which are still being defined and kind of gently challenged. But basically, it sets much more granular and detailed licensing categories for payment providers. And I think the big change is that payment facilitators, or in open banking speak, the payment initiation service providers, PISPs, it looks like they may be now covered under this new payments categorization. That is not 100% clear, but basically, in addition to remittance and FX and, you know, payment intermediaries, there is indeed a category for payment facilitators that have the ability to initiate payments on behalf of others, but are not actually intermediating and collecting on behalf of. So it's not like a treasury risk, but it's more of an IT security risk, because you're delegating access to a third party that's initiating the payment on your behalf. Work in progress, but at least I think, and kudos to Bank Indonesia for having really ambitious new regulations around standardized real-time payments mechanism. There's a whole other discussion around what's called IBT or BI Fast and Snap, which is their API standard, but that's primarily for interbank real-time payments, kind of similar to what India and Thailand have done with UPI and PromptPay respectively. Now, the reason I say Indonesia is complicated is because the data side is a completely different story. So the data side, there's a bit of data aggregation and digital consent and how authentication is done and how those technical handshakes are done between data provider and data recipient, how consent is captured and stored, who has the right to store data or to share data on behalf of. That is still very much a work in progress. I would say today it is de facto housed under OJK or OJK, which is the securities regulator / non-bank FI regulator. They are indeed regulating, and they have a regulatory sandbox for alternative credit scoring. They have provided some opinions on digital consent and e-signature, but just transparently speaking, I think those regulations vary by the department and by the type of FI being regulated. In other words, it is not a standardized situation. So payments, I think, pretty clear guidance. A year ago, I would have said payments, it's still a work in progress, but actually payments, very clear guidance now. But identity and data, and then for other banking as a service, you know, account opening and others, it's still a bit of it's still something to watch closely. And for now, you can largely say is unregulated, with a few exceptions. Next slide, please. Just quickly on Thailand. So Thailand BOT has been working behind the scenes on an open banking roadmap, and they are indeed planning it for publication in 2022. I do not know this for certain, but I expect it to be more guidelines-ish, not a mandate. So more in the frame of a Philippines rather than a Europe or in Indonesia. There is actually an open banking pilot underway, if you can call it that. It's basically a data exchange between voluntary participating banks. I think it's only 4 kind of large banks that have agreed to participate in this voluntarily under the aegis of the Thai Bankers Association. So it's very much a limited commercial pilot undertaken by the Thai Bankers Association, overseen by the BOT. Payments is largely controlled by the by the industry-owned switch, and the payment initiation model is really not yet defined. And I have experienced this personally wearing the Broncos hat, because certain banks will only provide, so a handful of banks already do have payment APIs that they make available to third parties, and they may have a structure or a licensing model, like a API licensing model to do so. But certain compliance departments of banks have interpreted that as only licensed payment processors can access these APIs, whereas others are say, well, as long as you meet certain standards for, ISO 27000 compliance and certain IT security checks, then you can have access to these APIs as a third-party provider. So it's very much done at the firm level on the payment side, but I think we'll get a lot more guidance early next year from Thailand, and the BOT is looking very closely at this. Singapore, I think, is a great example of a commercially led model with some very light guidelines and a lot of commercial initiatives. So for those of you who live in Singapore, you probably used SG Findex, whether or not you know the name of it, but that's basically now you can link your DBS account inside your OCBC app or vice versa. It's balanced at a minimum, but most banks, I think, they're arm twisting to also provide transaction data as well. But it's a very kind of early dip your toe in the water use case for open banking. And then there are a number, and I think true kind of Singapore government fashion, there's a number of subsidized or Singapore government partnered commercial initiatives to drive bottom-up adoption. And 3 examples of this are Apex, which is the API marketplace. MAS has an open API directory. So actually on MAS is the Central Bank of Singapore, the Monetary Authority, they have a directory with all of the FIs that do have published APIs where you can access them and kind of categorize in a single place. And then they also have Proxtera and SG TradeDex launching next year, which will be specifically for B2B payments, or sorry, B2B open data and payments as well. But these are kind of public-private partnerships and really meant to drive innovation rather than mandating a requirement.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting there, Todd. Just, we've got a slide with Thailand and Singapore on it. And you such physically 2 different countries, completely different population, category, size, type. There's no way that a one-size-fits-all sort of, thing is going to happen, right? But still, there's some principles that will be the same, but we're going to, certainly, of course, be seeing different things going on, which, it shows why it's so important. We have to take a kind of country approach while trying to keep an Asian and even a global kind of perspective as we go. Okay.
Yeah, and so an example in Singapore. I mean, Singapore is one of the most advanced financial services industries and regulatory regimes in the world, and yet right now that the SG Findex is only available to member banks, right? So there's not yet a framework for how would a third party securely access SG Findex to build that into a budgeting app, right?
And I see in the chat here somebody, I assume that's something of a complaint that there's no, you can't get a transaction, you only see end of month balances or something. So, it's you can't take anything for granted in this game. Okay, do you want to?
Yeah, so just let me cover just very quickly on Philippines. Sorry, this is kind of dense, but let me just summarize it. And then John, you can share some of the work that OBE is doing directly with the regulator. So I think Philippines is a pretty cool example of industry setting guidelines and then also encouraging commercial innovation. So there are 2 regulators that matter directly and are overseeing directly open finance development. So one is the BSP, the central bank. And in June 2021, they issued a circular, it's publicly available, called Guidelines for the Adoption of an Open Finance Framework, which is basically the pre-regulation that sets out the objectives and the roadmap. And it also establishes an industry-led body to participate in the development of the regulations, which is the Open Finance Oversight Committee, or OFOC, which John can share more in a bit. There is also an open finance pilot of which Broncos is a participant, but we have 17 participating FIs. And this is purely a bottom-up, commercially led approach where FIs petitioned the BSP under the BSP's test and learn approach, which is a framework under their fintech supervision department, where they said, look, we see commercial opportunity. We want, I think the way they described it is not necessarily a green light, but at least confirmed absence of a red light, so that they can proceed with some early commercial use cases for open finance. And the 3 use cases that are defined and already approved by the BSP include data aggregation, payment initiation, and also retail account opening. The second body I want to cover is the National Privacy Commission, which is pretty forward-thinking for this part of the world. To my awareness, it's one of the only bodies that really is the central point for consumer data protection and setting standards for what safe data handling should look like. And it's really, of course, it's taken inspiration from GDPR in Europe, but it allows for companies to proactively register and become NPC certified. Next year, there will be a trust mark certification so that you can actually kind of build NPC certification into your brand, so to speak, and say, yes, we've gone through the rigor of adopting the Philippines data privacy standards. It provides regulatory guidelines on secure data handling, and indeed they've provided guidance on automation of digital banking activities, which you can interpret to include versions of bots and scraping and kind of non-sanctioned APIs that provide an open banking experience to customers. And they also are launching a forthcoming regulatory sandbox where they can evaluate and provide some supervision for new technologies that are not yet directly regulated. Yeah, John, do you want to give more color on Philippines?
Yeah, I will. I'll talk a bit about the OFOC on next slide. Before I do, one question just to clarify. This pilot, I mean, the word pilot I find a little confusing, but these are actually live instances, aren't they? These are 17 or whatever live banks or live FIs who are doing something in this space, while the BSP have their reflections around what's going on. So yeah,
not all 17 yet.
Okay,
but they've all indicated interest, and I think we have 6 or 7 that have live API products commercially available today.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so the fact it's live and it's really happening, I think is just worth pulling out, because this word pilot, I think we all get a bit confused by it sometimes. So as Todd said, the BSP, the central bank in the Philippines, published this circular middle of this year, and they've created a committee. In fact, it's the beginnings of a committee, the OFOC, the Open Finance Oversight Committee. They've created the transition group, and they're doing something that's quite smart, I think. And I can say I know because the BSP are being supported by the IFC, and the IFC have brought us in as OBE to help lead the OFOC transition group through a thought process to understand what they should be doing as a result of the circular. So if you see that the BSP have started off with a policy statement here on the kind of top left, this policy, the circular that was published in June. They've created a transition group to sort of this OFOC transition group which is made up of financial institutions from the kind of traditional banking side, but also sort of fintech side, bringing them into the room and taking them through a series of workshops to say, okay, well, we've told you what you want to do as a policy statement. You as industry, how do you want to react to this? What's the kind of the blueprint or the framework or the structure that you see emerging in the Philippines to meet these policy aims and bring open banking, open finance out there? So that's the phase we're currently working in. Quite what will, how that will then roll out as time goes on is to be seen. But this group will have its blueprint, and then everyone will look at that, the BSP, the rest of the market, and as a result of that, there'll be a second wave of okay, so we know all the bits we need to build now. We've identified where we need standards. We've identified where we need processes. We've identified where we need some more rules or something a bit stronger. Now let's put in some governance and actually build, just choose those standards, choose those rules, choose those processes, and take it to market. And just so we're all clear, none of this stuff is going to happen quickly, in the sense of quick that digital technology companies mean quick, 4 months, 6 months. For a market to move at a government level, and then the industry to follow, these are generally 2 or 3 year processes that happen in sort of 6 to 8 month wave chunks of kind of phasing. So again, it is very interesting, the fact that we've got live pilots in the country and people actually doing stuff. We've got the sort of top-down thing now going on. And now that, the challenge really is to be able to listen to everybody, learn from the pilots, map it with the policy statements, and come up with the right way forward on this. So these, anyway, the BSP have selected the group, and we'll be sending out more information publicly. Obviously, we won't speak about anything that's not already kind of known or said, but it's a good example of the government giving the push and then trying to give industry the voice to then say, well, how do we want to do this? Which isn't an easy process, but again, it's probably a topic for another day. So that's the Philippines. That's our sort of very fast, jump around Asia in one webinar. Obviously, we could do an entire webinar on any one of these countries. Todd, I think you were going to say a few things. You've got a few names up here about people who are, also, go ahead.
No, so I think in a separate session, would love to share some of the use cases that we're already seeing emerging. Again, that's a session on its own, and sort of seeing what the business case looks like with open banking. But I also want to kind of point out that this is already happening even in the absence of regulation. And this is really a ripe time for tech companies that are looking to fill a gap that is demanded by end users and by businesses that are building fintech products, right? So Broncos is one of them, both supporting it data and payments APIs. We have the likes of Contomatic and SaltEdge that are both coming out of Europe, taking lessons learned from the European banking model, and they're already operating in Southeast Asia. Now, most of what they are doing is, the common term is scraping. Scraping is not a helpful term because it means many things to many people, and good or bad. But really what they're doing is what a lot of companies do when banks do not have a sanctioned API, which is they're running a bot. They're running an automated service, usually from an automated web, like an automated web session that is automating an action that the customer would otherwise do manually. And even the likes of Plaid and TrueLayer in the UK, where this is mandated, still have to run bots because the banks do not comply, even though they are required to. They'll cite an IT migration, core banking system migration. They'll cite security review or whatever, and they'll have their API down for 3-4 months at a time. There was a really interesting guidance that came out from the European regulator in April, basically saying that web automation is a fallback mechanism if APIs are not available, because the regulator recognizes that in the absence of, even if they are requiring banks, that the banks that don't want to play ball will find a way to make reasons, right? And we've seen this, for example, when real-time payments come in, where some of the banks have to be dragged kicking and screaming. So anyway, a couple examples I want to put here. This is not just bank account data aggregation. So in the case of Smile, Smile is a relatively new company that is focusing specifically on identity and income verification for gig workers. So Upwork or Freelancer or Grab drivers, the ride-sharing app, or Gojek drivers in Indonesia, and providing income and identity verification to support a consumer lending use case, or a basic budgeting app, or even serving that data back to to a bank, right? You have Finantier, who's basically setting up an alternative credit scoring model, and you have OBE, which is actually a payment gateway, but they're now running corporate account data as a way to provide easier reconciliation for their payment gateway merchants, right? So it's not just data aggregation. There are many, many use cases that are already emerging and existing out in the market today.
Cool. Well, look, we're beginning to run out of time. I see in the chat we're getting caught up for missing out onebrick.io from Indonesia. Of course, this is just some examples on the slide, but well done for promoting something there for OneBrick. There's also quite an interesting question come in the chat around the influence of foreign institutions in the domestic regulatory discussions. I think we're probably getting a bit short on time to kind of open this box up too much, but all I would say is, certainly from what I've seen, within this sort of IFC work that we're doing with the Philippines, is it's the Philippine Central Bank, the BSP, who are driving the show. They're setting policy, they're setting the agenda, and any work that's happening kind of with this OFOC committee, whatever, people from outside can only ever provide advice and some kind of frameworks or guidance. It has to be people in local markets who know what they want saying what's going to happen locally. So I'm not quite sure where that question's going. I'm happy to have maybe that's something we have a bit more of a dialogue on, kind of bilaterally, and then bring into another topic. But I don't know, yeah, foreign influence and how much of a problem that is, not quite sure. So with that, I think we'll sort of come to the last couple of slides, bit of a wrap up on, okay, that's nice. We've done a good tour de table and really what's going on. What do we intend to do as we launch? So we are setting up Open Banking Asia. Here we are, OBE Asia. This is a first webinar. We'll be doing a bigger launch next year, but we're up and running and we're getting the rollout ready. I think just to go through sort of 6 boxes of how we see this. Certainly, we'll be doing monthly webinars. We'll publish a program. We'll tell you what the those topics are. And we've got quite a lot of experience of doing this in different countries. We tend to find there's a sort of rhythm of 1 in 3 would probably be around use cases and how it's used. 1 in 3 is probably a kind of, okay, so what's going on in this country or what's going on in this country, and a bit of a state of play deep dive. And then 1 in 3, perhaps a bit more operational, a bit more, how does it work? Standard security, what are different countries doing? But it's also to be guided by your input, by the input of the discussions that we'll be holding with stakeholders. So we'll be having Todd, his team will be going around and discussing with both regulators, but also the market players inside countries and across countries. What are the problems? And of course, there's a lot of organizations, associations who have a voice here as well. So trying to get that map together, and with that knowledge, it's about building that up a period of research and data to be able to share it, to be able to tell people what's going on, and give people an idea of, because there's a lot of conversations happening, some of them behind closed doors, some of them more open. But even the open stuff, finding it is hard work. So bringing that into one place and having an intelligent conversation around it, educating on the benefits and the use cases, and then following different country rollouts. Or in fact, we will be having different country rollouts during next year. We'll probably starting with the Philippines, but again, we'll post a timetable where we'll actually be creating member groups inside individual countries, and then holding Asian level webinars month on month. At least that's the plan. Todd, do you want to add anything to that? What are your hopes for 2022, kind of in this context? And you're muted. Had to happen once, right?
I sure am. Yeah. No, thanks. I think really excited to be working with OBE and learning from your experience. I think 2022 is the year that open finance takes off in Southeast Asia in particular. The regulators are already working on kind of the first set of guidelines. The industry has already started. In fact, a lot of it was really energized by COVID. And in 2021, you saw a lot of those use cases going live. I think I can tell you from on the ground experience, the FIs are starting to actually think about how to commercialize open finance as products and think about these new distribution models. So what I want to get out of 2022, or at least to help my fellow industry cohort, is to identify how to make open finance benefit the industry. And benefit the industry means unlock customer groups that may not be seen as accessible previously, provide regulatory guidance in a way that benefits not just large incumbents or not just fintechs, but also provides that balance. Removes a lot of the FUD, to use a crypto term, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or that open banking equals I'm going to lose my customer information, or open banking means scamming, or open bank, right? There's a lot of this FUD because there is not yet clear standards globally communicated locally into these Asia markets about what safe open banking practices are. So I think setting up an OBE Asia forum where we can talk openly about what that balance is, I think is really important.
There's a lot of negative publicity and spin, positive, negative spin. There's a lot said, and half of it is kind of not true, and it's quite hard to work out, okay, so what is really going on, and if we're anything, I think it's there to be that kind of voice of this is what's actually happening, and help ensure that things do develop in a safe, reasonable, useful way in each country. So
that's right. Great. Do you want to just before we wrap up, do you want to answer the last question, and then I can wrap up? There's one more in the chat.
There's one. Oh yeah, there's one more about the Philippines. I think we'll take that. I mean, it's a specific one on the Philippines and maybe what the BSP did. I think I'd have to digest that a bit more. So I think we're on the hour as well. So probably. Okay. I think why don't you just wrap it up, Todd, on this?
Sure. So thanks everyone. My contact details are here. Please ping us if you have questions, if you have ideas for future seminars. But thank you so much for attending. Hopefully this gave you a view of what OBE Asia will be all about. Hopefully it encourages you to attend future sessions. Thank you so much for taking a piece of your evening to learn from us. Have a great week ahead. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks everybody.